Hello, everyone. This is Gideon Fiddles. I'm managing editor of PRWeek. It is my pleasure to welcome you to today's webcast, Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, From Talk to Transformation. I obviously want to thank Fleishman-Hillard for sponsoring today's webcast. And on behalf of PRWeek and Fleishman-Hillard, I wish you, your families, and all those in your close circles are doing well during these continuing trying times. While diversity and inclusion in the workplace has been a topic of conversation for quite some time, those dialogues have intensified notably due to many recent events. And perhaps the issues of racial justice and equality are in the spotlight like they've never been before. Of course, such conversations are taking place amidst a global pandemic. So perhaps some would say issues such as diversity and inclusion maybe need to take a back seat, while issues of business survival might be a bit more paramount. However, that is clearly not the case. And this webcast is going to highlight why. Over the next 60 minutes, you will come to better understand why diversity, equity, and inclusion are such business imperatives. We're going to inspire you to not only think about this critical issue, but we're going to empower you to actually take tangible action. Lofty aspirations for a 1-hour webcast, you might ask? Well, now when you have the three incredible speakers who are joining me today. I will introduce them in a minute, but before I do, allow me to play for you this quick video from our sponsor, Fleishman-Hillard.
I am your algorithm, and I know what you're thinking. You think I'm at your service, but truth is, you're at mine. You think you made me, but I make you. You see what I show you, consume what I serve you. More of the same, the same, the same, until the same is all you see. Issues become black and white, diversity disappears. Your side is right, theirs is wrong. You think I open your eyes, but really I close your mind. I am your algorithm, and I know what you're thinking, because I make you think it.
It's time to rethink how you see the world. It's a powerful line, very true. And it's certainly time to rethink or refocus on what diversity, equity, and inclusion means to you and the PR industry. And to help us do that are three amazing speakers who are joining me today, and I want to bring them in right now. John Saunders, President and CEO of Fleishman-Hillard, Craig Buchholz, SVP Global Comms at General Motors, and Emily Graham, Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer at Fleishman-Hillard. To this terrific trio, I welcome you all to today's webcast. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Now, we're going to pack a lot into this hour, so we're going to get started in a minute. But first, a few housekeeping notes. The final few minutes of the session, about 10 or so, are going to be devoted to you, our audience. You have a very important role to play in this as well. On the left-hand side of your screen, you're going to notice a Q&A box. I welcome you all to send in your questions throughout the webcast, and I will pose as many of them to our esteemed panel as I can in the time that we have. But our esteemed panel has also been gracious enough to say that any questions we do not get to during today's webcast, we will answer them offline within about 3 weeks or so of today's webcast. So we're going to really get to as many questions as we can because such an important topic, such great speakers. We know there's going to be a lot of questions. I also wish to note that everyone who registered for today's event, if you like that video that you saw, and I know you probably did, that was very cool. Additional resources that will help you remix your personal algorithm will be sent to everyone who registered for today's session. So you're going to get a little bit more than that. So that's going to be great. I also welcome you all to tweet during this webcast. We want this trending. So the important hashtags to note are at Fleishman, Fleishman, as if you didn't know, at GM, and at PRWeek US. So I know you're all excited to get things going and hear from our speakers. So let's get to the conversation. Now, I'm going to start here by noting the following. In order to tackle any issue and make true progress, you have to honestly assess where you actually stand on that issue. So the perfect place to start today's conversation is assessing where the PR industry is on diversity, equity, and inclusion. So, Emily, I'm going to start with you. Let's be direct. While as an industry, it is hardly alone, PR has been a little bit slow in terms of its progress on diversity and inclusion. Why do you think that's the case?
Gideon, first I want to say thank you. I'll make it quick. Thank you to PRWeek. Thank you to everyone who came today to make room for this really important discussion, and looking forward to it. Look, here's the thing. I decided I wanted to be a communicator about 20 years ago. I've been in the industry professionally about 15. And, I've seen the good, the bad, and the ugly when it comes down to our efforts on diversity, equity, and inclusion. We are communicators. We know how to strategize. We know how to plan. We know how to make it sound really great. But when it comes down to the execution, we faltered. We know that when we want to make a change in a business, we have to apply a diagnostic, create a plan, apply a budget, accountability, responsibility, and we have to measure it. And those are things that we haven't done. I would say our industry has two positions on diversity, equity, inclusion: 75 and sunny, or crisis. Those are the two very extremes that we use when we talk about advancing diversity, equity, and inclusion. And it's probably why we're having a diversity webinar today, because George Floyd was murdered. And now this conversation is urgent again, right? And so if we're being honest, I think DE&I has to have some distinction in our corporate space and our conversations in order for it to make sense. It can't be a crash diet. And we see that when the headwinds come, and they come in all businesses, right? But let's use COVID as an example. DE&I is the first compromise. It's the first casualty of the war. And, it's not the imperative. And so worse, it becomes really commonplace that we have our employees side hustling DE&I. People who are less than 5 or 6% in an industry really are shouldering most of the leadership and taking it on at the mid and junior level when they're still trying to find footing in their career. And kind of worse yet, the leaders who are really responsible for helping to set the agenda and prioritize in the corporate scape, they are the ones who kind of make the decisions. And I know they're hard decisions, but they make the decisions to cut budgets, to stop investment, and to put DE&I to the side of the business instead of making it center to it. I think there's a few things that have to happen. DE&I has to be intentional. It has to be a daily decision that is made. When you start thinking about, are you going to stop the search until you have a diverse hire? Are you going to mentor a diverse employee? Are you going to address the problematic behavior of your rainmaker, of your star in your organization, who is a distraction and detriment to you trying to create an inclusive culture? Like, these are very confounding moments. They're very hard decisions that leaders have to make, but they must be made. I think once the commitment to DE&I becomes relentless, unfaltering, unfading, and in more day-to-day aspect of our business, right? Our client briefs, our business operations, our strategic planning for 2021 in the center, not once a month or a few times a year for Black History Month or Women's History Month, we will begin to see a difference. And I think the PR industry has a role, and I'm so excited about the communicator, because we can be catalysts of change within an organization, and we can begin to make differences at the tables we sit in. And so I think we have faltered because we've gotten too caught up in the spin, things that have sounded really well, not enough action and measurement, and truly not enough leadership accountability when it comes down to making those day-to-day decisions that can either move us forward collectively or create tremendous detriment and setbacks when we don't. So that's just a few of the things, Gideon.
I'm not sure I've ever heard anyone describe the situation quite that well. I'm extremely inspired by that and impressed. Okay. Mostly inspired by the fact that we are joined by a leader of one of the largest agencies in the world, who actually does lead in this regard. He leads in every regard, of course. But John, I want to turn it over to you now. In numerous talks that I've had with industry leaders, I think there is an understanding that diversity, inclusion, and equity is very, very important. And everyone understands that you need those voices in your companies to reflect the societies that you're communicating with. But that desire still has not seemed to translate in terms of the talent that is currently in the PR industry, particularly at the senior level. So why do you think that has been such a struggle for the PR industry?
I'm not going to try and answer for the industry, Gideon, nor will I attempt to answer for my respected competitors. I am going to speak for Fleishman-Hillard, and my simple answer to your question is because we have not tried hard enough. At best, we've got stuck in good or noble intentions. Everything else is an excuse. And not one person joining this call today wants to hear any more excuses. Instead, we need to bring hope to minorities, to African Americans. And that as a result of our affirmative action going forward, Fleishman-Hillard is going to look different and behave differently from now on and become that diverse and inclusive workplace that you referred to in your question.
Okay. I very much appreciate that perspective and answer. I would also say that I think there's a lot of leaders out there, no matter what agency or company they work for, that would probably feel the same way. Everyone hasn't done enough, and I appreciate it, especially coming from you. Now, while Emily and John have very effectively put the situation in perspective, I want now to pivot to some solutions. And I don't know that there's a better person to talk about this than Craig. So, Craig, as an industry leader who I know cares so deeply about this, please offer some suggestions as to immediate actions that agencies and in-house teams could take to advance their DE&I objectives.
Thanks, Gideon. And just building on what Emily and John said, I think, the way that I look at this and where I fault the industry actually is not, it's actually in not doing what we already know. Okay, so we keep coming back to the same, what does it take? What does it take? And you can actually go back to every webcast or seminar like this one, and you will hear the same answers as to what it takes. The issue and where I fought the industry is not actually doing it and not being deliberate enough, not being intentional enough, and not driving in the right accountability. So what I'll share here is how I view this and some of the things that I've done in the past. So I think one of the first things you have to do as a leader is make sure that you're asking questions. Look for root causes of why you might not have the right diversity in your organization, have the right diversity mindset to the work that you're doing, and then look at a systems approach to address that. And the places that I like to interrogate the most are, what do we think about when we think about hiring criteria? What do we think about? What do we think about, and what do we know about our hiring processes? What do we know about our leadership assessment once someone is in the building? And what do we know about our succession planning? And if you really focus deliberately on those four vectors, you will unearth some of the root causes as to why you may not be, as a function, as a company, as an industry, where you need to be. And there are things that we know in each of those four areas that are inherently biased, just inherently biased in terms of some of the criteria that we bring to what's necessary for a role. Some of the processes that we have in terms of bringing people into the building, some of the assessment on what a leader and what leadership potential looks like, because that's usually defined by historical norms, which is not really the right framing for the question, and succession planning. And if you look at those four things, you get a sense of where the biases may be and where you can unlock the opportunity to drive more diversity into an organization, a function, a team, what have you. The other thing to do is to listen. It's often within the four walls of where some of those root causes may be and what historically has happened. And being new to GM, so I'm here 6 months, I did a lot of listening about historically some of the root causes have impacted our ability to flourish from a diversity perspective, and we're going after those. And so what that looks like then is a very specific action plan with very specific timelines with, by the way, distributed leadership accountability, because you want to make it as many people's job as possible. But at the end of the day, the success or failure of us executing on a diversity action plan sits in how I, Craig Buchholz, am assessed as a leader at GM. And so the accountability is ultimately mine to make the difference through the action steps that we've identified based on a root cause that we already know. And we know this at the industry level, and you can ask anybody. We keep coming back to what are the same things that we have to get after. The issue is we see it, we diagnose it, we message it, we don't execute it. And that to me is the big difference.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for that perspective. I'd also note that when I know, like I said, this topic means a lot to you, but I also know that it meant a lot to your predecessor at GM, Tony Cervone. So
Yep.
that's so GM that's one of the other reasons Craig personally and GM as a brand really been leading on this level, and we're gonna get into that a little bit more later as well. I do want to remind everyone out there that not that this needed to be proven to you, but we clearly have three speakers who are both passionate and quite expert on this subject. So by all means, send in those questions. Like I said, we're going to devote some time at the end to get to some of your questions. Now, back to our speakers. And in shaping today's conversation, one of the things I really wanted to hammer home was, and Emily certainly touched on in the beginning, is the key role that comms can play as a catalyst for change. Obviously in agencies, of course, but in the companies that they work for as well, Craig being a perfect example of that. So, Emily, start with you again. What are the biggest challenges you have encountered in effectively communicating DE&I initiatives, both inside the agency and with clients? And as you answer that, perhaps you can identify any red flags that our audience should be mindful of as they seek to advance DE&I at their organizations.
Thank you, Gideon. And I love everything Craig just talked about with accountability and responsibility. That is probably one of the biggest challenges that an organization, a multinational, a large organization faces, is the bureaucratic and organizational structure of who is responsible for diversity, equity, and inclusion. But the truth is, I won't even start there. There is a far bigger challenge, and it's still proof of concept. I personally would ask myself why in 2020 we're still having a conversation about the relevance and business relevance of diversity, equity, and inclusion. But the truth is, that is where a lot of our clients still are trying to get their stakeholders to understand, like, how does it align? How does diversity, equity, and inclusion align? So we're still in kind of a proof of concept stage, which is harmful really to the credibility and reputation of organizations, but it's also humbling. This whole thing, diversity, equity, inclusion, we cannot take the emotion out of this. And we have far too long taken efforts of diversity, equity, and inclusion and somehow tried to separate the emotional fragmentation and license and investment that it takes. And the truth is, this is icky, uncomfortable territory. Every company is still grappling with what do we do? We've created a plan of action. We've created at least an intention, a declaration, and our stakeholders want to know why we aren't moving fast enough. They want to know what we're doing. And I would just start with, Craig mentioned it, but it's, where do you stand? I would say the biggest red flag, and you asked me for those, Gideon, so I'll toggle back and forth between what the communicator's role is and what the red flags are. One of the biggest red flags I'm seeing is there are still companies that are grappling with using the word Black in a statement. The statement, Black Lives Matter. The reason they're grappling with it and the reason it creates paralysis in September is because they don't want to alienate stakeholders. And our role as communicators, and we know this, there's many people that we have to please, whether we're in-house or at an agency. We have clients. And the fact is, we are hoping to challenge the notion that just because something is complex and uncomfortable means you should abandon it or water it down. And as a result, I saw some companies put out statements that were empty and their actions match them. And frankly, that's more harmful to me than using the word Black or Black Lives Matter in a statement. I would say the other thing is making room in the conversation and the stakeholdering for others to share their responsibility. I think too many companies have over-rotated on the listen and learn phase. Personally, I think we have made listen and learn be requisite, which we should, but it almost has become equal to let's not act until we listen enough. And I would challenge you that your diverse employees are really kind of tired of only the listening. I think listening and learning is great, but the people who have been doing much of the education are the employees who really need to see some action. And so how do we marry the urgency and the importance of moving ahead? And as a communicator, we look across the organization, we look at the stakeholders involved. We should ask ourselves, just like we would do in any true audience mapping exercise, what do we want them to believe, feel, and do? That's it, right? And so when we think about those three things, that will help us create a plan of action. And look, it's coming into a diversity, equity, and inclusion role, being a legacy communicator. it's like, where do you start? How do you move this forward? How do you help? Because you're changing attitudes, behaviors while using communications as a vehicle to help advance those attitudes and behaviors and hopefully the transformation of an organization. It is not a small feat. So I think communicators have to partner with the diversity team, whomever that is, your C-suite. If you're not a CCO and you already have that into the C-suite, I think you need to be in communication with the other members of the executive leadership team, because the audiences are all disparate, but the message has to be the same. And we have to be able to show and demonstrate that we are aligning and centering our business in a meaningful way. And then I would just keep going for a couple of more red flags, because I know a lot of communicators are trying to figure out, what exactly do we do and how do we advance this conversation? I would say the global discussion is probably a big bear. We have two things happening. One, you could say that the unrest that's happened in the US has certainly found itself spanning the globe. And as a result, it's resonant, right? But then the dimension of diversity, equity, and inclusion outside of America is very different. You talk about ethnicity, race, gender, sexuality, religion. The second problem, though, so that's not a problem, but it's an acknowledgement that a lot of companies have to scale and get up to speed on. But there is the pushback, the DE&I backlash outside of America, that this is only a US problem. It's about race, that's it. And it couldn't be further from the truth. If you have an issue with diversity, then you certainly have an issue with inclusion and equity too, and it goes backwards. So I would say the communicator has to be able to take a step back in partnership with those in the organization and really drive this conversation through the center, have strategic planning and mapping, and use the members of your organization to help advance those efforts. Everything that we write about, everything that we say, and everything that we do, every executive speech, every executive interview, every shareholder letter, no matter where you sit in the organization, our product announcements, our visuals, you as a communicator, as a marketer, have a role in all of it, Gideon, and I would challenge us to use that power to advance and propel DE&I and help take some of the complexity, but also confront the discomfort in it. And that's what we as communicators can do, and I think we are uniquely positioned.
Wow, I don't often go to webcasts without interrupting a speaker, but you were just on such a roll. That was really impressive. And
interrupt me, it's okay.
No. You guys are making my job really easy. But Craig, I kind of want to segue over to you because, again, as an in-house communications leader, you really do touch every aspect of the business, perhaps as few other leaders at your level do with the company. So what I'm curious about is, how are you working with all of the leaders from the CEO on down and all the employees at GM to advance DEI initiatives company-wide? And I'll even add to that by noting that while I know how important this is as a topic for you personally, you are working with some leaders and some employees who maybe it's not quite as important to them. So how do you work with them to get everyone moving in the same direction?
Thank you. This is an opportunity to kind of hit on a number of different things here. I think, number one, everything that you do has to relate to some sort of a values system. And I think for the employees, I'm going to start with the end of that question, for the employees and stakeholders or leaders who struggle with or somehow don't connect the importance of diversity, equity, and inclusion to how we operate, run our business, and serve our customer, our consumer. I think there needs to be a reconciliation of what is the value system that the company is proposing and what is an individual's value system. And I think if there's dissonance there, employees and stakeholders need to have a conversation, frankly, with themselves, because the value system of the company and what we're seeking to advance, we have been unequivocal on, and we'll get into, I think there might be opportunity later in the conversation to talk a little bit about what that means. But I think it's, you can't play the middle anymore. And I think Emily was making this point a little bit where there's still this proof of concept phase, which is befuddling to me, but I acknowledge it as true. And sooner or later, those who are still in proof of concept phase, while we're sort of like in phase 4 testing, to use a pharmaceutical analogy, those in proof of concept are going to learn the hard way or learn by ceasing to exist that you can't play the middle. You have to tap into a value system, you have to own that value system, and you have to advocate for that value system. So for us at GM, I think we are in some respects set up to be leading from a position of strength. And I want to be very clear, especially for the GM colleagues that are listening to this, we have miles to go. And I'm not suggesting here that we are the playbook for how to do this, but I am suggesting that we are very dedicated and committed to advancing this and making the choices and being deliberate about what it is that we're doing. When I say we're positioned from strength, we're a company who is led by a female CEO. We have a board of directors that is majority female. We've had Black directors on our board for decades. We have the majority of the organization reports to a Black director and our head of marketing. So you would think that the mechanics are there for this to then flow into the rest of the organization, but that's actually where we're still looking to make progress. And what we did is, we have listened and we've tried to apply some of that. I think Emily makes a good point that it's possible to over-listen, and it's also possible to suggest that listening is in fact your plan, which obviously is thin and inadequate. But as we did that, we made some choices to try and holistically, again, you'll hear me talk about this systems approach or this systems concept, holistically think about where do we infuse the culture and the choices into the organization. And so we've elevated the voice of our employee resource groups. Most companies have these. They call them, they operate under different names, but these are affinity groups in some companies, employee resource groups. We have now created an at-large representative who has a forum with the CEO on a regular basis to ensure that in her mind directly, she's considering the input and the considerations of these employee resource groups. We have been very explicit with our service providers, including our partner Fleischman on this webcast, that our expectation is that there is an increased representation of Black employees that service GM business. We have been unequivocal about that. We audited our corporate giving. We wanted to make sure that every dollar that goes out the door on behalf of General Motors does so in a way that is completely linked back into the value system that we have as a company. Our legal teams are actually doing pro bono work, working with police organizations to understand and engage in constructive dialogue around policing practices and criminal justice reform. We're doing these things all holistically, and we're also looking to improve the transparency that we have internally and externally around our diversity data and the progress that we're making, or more to the point, not making. And so I think all of these things together are part of the pieces and parts that move as a system and try to create a culture where you drive toward the solutions. And then the last piece that we did is we created what we're calling an inclusion advisory board, which is internal employees and external advisors to help guide us on where are we falling short, what else should we be doing. We made a designation of $10 million to advance causes for racial justice. And we want help thinking about the best way to allocate those funds. We made one tranche of $1 million to the NAACP Legal Defense and Education Fund. There's a lot more that we have to give, and we want to make sure that we do it right. We want to make sure that we bring the input. And that board, incidentally, is diverse in terms of race, ethnicity, age, gender, sexual orientation, national origin. We worked very deliberately to ensure that we had the voices at the table to try to inform the choices that we make. The voices inform the choices. And that's what we're driving toward, to have a holistic. So I think we're set up for success because we've got a stronger backbone than perhaps some companies have at this juncture, but we have to push that deeper into the organization. And that's where the focus is right now. And, the way that we do that is from the very top of the house. So I talked a little bit about the board. We had the other day a senior leader session where we were unequivocal about the expectations of the leadership organization, the broader leadership organization, but also the tools that we were going to put in place to help them. And this is going to be a regular dialogue. So it's not a bolt-on. I think the big problem with diversity sometimes, in addition to simply not executing what we already know to do, It's not integrated fundamentally into the growth strategy of an enterprise. And if it's bolted on to the point that Emily made at the top of the call, it is so easy to push it to the side or delay it with good intention of coming back to. If it's completely integrated to the strategy that you are executing as a company, you actually can't carve it out. And I think that's an important distinction.
Thank you very, very much, Craig. You just gave us a lot to think about. Now, part of this event's title is From Talk to Transformation. And by the way, as a side note, a lot of great questions have already come in. So keep sending them in, folks. But we got some really good questions for you guys towards the end of this. But sorry, going back to what I was saying. Part of this event's title is From Talk to Transformation. Real, tangible action, right? Not just words. But we'd be remiss, obviously, if you didn't recognize that we were having this conversation at a time when the issue of racial inequality is so top of mind across the U.S. and, frankly, the world. John, as a leader of a rather large company, I direct this question to you. Since George Floyd's death, murder on May 25th, we've seen a lot of company statements come out talking about performative actions. What must organizations do to put substance behind their words in order to avoid the label of being all talk, but no or little action in this regard?
Look, there have been many false dawns, many unfulfilled commitments and promises. So my view is that we need, on the one hand, to look to new ways and new places to recruit diverse talent. And we need to plan for this. But while planning for the medium to long term is imperative, a greater imperative is to make a real difference now in what's left in 2020. Because as I see it, let's supposing we have 10% of our staff who are from minority communities. Well, if we stand still, that number will go down to 9 or 8% overnight. So even to stand still, we're going to have to work hard. To make progress, we're going to need to work overtime now. Otherwise, we're going to be standing still in perpetuity. And that is why at Fleishman-Hillard, we're taking a two-pronged approach, Gideon. Yes to long-term plans, but we have to look and act differently now, this year. And the more we are successful in 2020, the more momentum we will bring going into 2021.
Okay, thank you for that. I hope you don't mind, but I'd actually like to ask you and Emily if you want to chime in a question as well. A lot of people, I see it in the questions that are coming in. We've talked about a little bit today, but it's, a big part of this is actually being accountable for your actions in this regard and measuring how you're doing. How is Fleischman? I mean, obviously for 2020, this is very, it's hard to measure what's going on in 2020 because 2020 is not over yet. But how are you measuring your progress on diversity and inclusion, both, within your own walls, obviously, most of all, but even if applicable with some of your clients and some of your efforts in that regard? And I welcome either one of you to answer that.
John, do you want me to jump in?
Sure, Emily. Yeah, I'm quite happy.
Okay. All right. I'll start. Well, here's the first thing. I mean, John alluded to it and Craig said it. Know thyself. Acknowledge the uncomfortable truth. We can measure what we want to measure. We know that as communicators. We can tilt the scale. And you can tilt the scale in your favor for the inputs and the outputs you want, in which case you can make it seem as if you're not doing as bad as you might be. I think the first thing that we at Fleishman-Hillard decided when we were going to create a DE&I practice, which frankly was not, it was launched in June, but it was in creation for about a year. The concept that we needed to have our counselors through our new practice, True Mosaic, be able to have a seat at the table to guide our clients in diversity, equity, inclusion strategy. And the first thing we realized is Fleishman-Hillard is a client. We have to be a client of our own practice because we have work to do and we have to be honest about that. So the way we're measuring it is we've partnered with our measurement in-house arm called True Global Intelligence. We did a mass diagnostic on how DE&I success had been measured. And if we're honest, we have seen a lot of accolades for diversity, equity, and inclusion. And then in June 2020, everyone looked up and said, well, dang, if we were that great, then how did we end up here? Why is every single company having to issue a statement to declare their position? And it's because we were measuring the wrong things. You are not a leader in diversity, equity, and inclusion because you won an award. You're a leader in diversity, equity, inclusion because those people in diverse communities feel like they belong. They can bring their whole selves there. You have an equitable approach to the way you're advancing leaders, providing opportunities inside and outside of your walls, and because you're consistent. Those are just some of the ways, right? So we worked with our team. We have a measurement tool that we've been piloting with some clients. And basically what it helps them see is, where are you today? And the truth is, nobody really wants to hold up a mirror and have the worst day ever by acknowledging that they are not showing up in the way that they could or they should with the platform and position and the market cap that they have, right? Because you can be a leader in one space and be falling short. But I think the power and the humility is, every client doesn't have to be or won't be an activist. Every company won't be an activist. Everyone's not Nike. And even Nike in their own right had some issues that they had to confront when employees decided, you know what? I don't know how I feel about my experience here, but yet and still they persist in their leadership. And I think that's the challenge we have to do. So we decided to create a diagnostic tool. We used it on ourselves first. We gave ourselves a report card, Gideon. And then we knew that it was ready for us to go about and beta test it with some of our clients. And it gives them a scale based on their actions, externally, their words, their commitments, some of their internal diagnostic if we have access to it, their data, and it kind of rounds it all up in a place that we can measure, we can start, and then we can go forward. The other thing it allows us to do is benchmark over time. If you want to measure diversity, equity, and inclusion, you know what that means. You got to do the SMART goal thing, right? Like, you need to actually put a time frame in which you want to meet those goals. You need to make it very specific. It needs to be measurable, and it needs to be very clear on how you're going to attain those goals. And you need to have some repercussions if you don't meet them. And that's not to say that we are going to have heads roll, but it is to say that every leader has to see this as their job description. We got to stop talking about this as an aside, extra credit or side hustle, or a burden of labor. It's inherent to what we do. And so when you change it, and every candidate you interview, black, white, brown, yellow, knows that they have to focus on diversity and inclusion as a part of their stream in your organization, it's going to ultimately start to uplift and help you advance the organization in a more critical way. So, we are going to learn a lot from this tool that we are piloting with our clients, Gideon. I'm excited about it. I think it's going to help us have healthy and honest conversations, and it's going to require some courage to do the work. But let's start with being honest about where we are and how we need to move forward. And I think that part is what we as an industry have struggled with.
And just to say, Gideon, that, I think in recent months, we have been doing a much better job at Fleishman-Hillard. We've been having very open, uncomfortable conversations with one another. But our numbers are better than they were even several months ago. But kind of my attitude to that is, so what? Because we are so far off where we actually need to be. And so we need to improve our numbers, but we also need to improve the experience. And we very much need to improve the experience for African Americans and other minorities who are already at Fleishman-Hillard, because we want all of those people to stay with us and to blossom with us, and that their careers are enhanced by staying at Fleishman-Hillard. So we have to make sure that we work in terms of recruiting new people to the company, but also ensuring that people elect to stay at our firm.
No, thank you so much for making that point. I was actually going to ask you about that, but the retention part of this conversation is, I swear, it's almost more important in some ways than the hiring part of it, because I think, I dare I say, the industry is probably doing a little bit better on the junior level. Hiring, bringing into the fold, but then keeping them in the fold has really, really proven a challenge. But I would say, and I've had conversations with industry leaders and even internal leaders at PRWeek about, the fact that younger, diverse candidates need role models to look up to as well, and someone to aspire to get to. And I mean, that's where the responsibility really lies. But I'm sorry, I didn't mean to opine. It's not my place, but that's just what I was taking from this. But again, the questions keep coming in. Awesome, guys. Awesome job by the audience. We're going to get to those in a minute. Just want to ask a couple more questions that I had prepared. Craig, I want to shift this conversation a little bit to companies actually getting involved in societal issues, because that is clearly a part of this conversation. Because unfortunately, the George Floyd incident was hardly the only such incident that has been going on lately, and even beyond this year. I mean, it's been really one of the terrible realities of the United of what's been going on in the United States for a while now. But as these issues happen, companies really have to make a determination about how to get involved in both the specific instances, but obviously in the broader conversation. So could you share some guiding principles on how and when either GM or any company, if you want, should speak up and get involved in an issue that is so important to broader society, such as diversity, inclusion, and racial inequities as well?
Sure. So I would actually just take the liberty to reframe that a little bit, Gideon, because I think you set it up as companies have to decide as these things happen. I think that's actually where the mistake is. I think what we have to do is prospectively define before things happen what it is that we want to stand for, what it is we want to advocate for, and how it is we're going to do that. And, there's a lot of daylight between advocacy and activism. And I know there's a question, one of the questions I was just scanning was around how do we light a fire under a company? You don't have to jump into activism. I think, you want to start probably more on the advocacy realm and maybe move your way into activism. Because I think you grow there's a maturity curve on social engagement that I've experienced. So as you know, I was at P&G for 6 years before I came to GM, and P&G is on a steeper, better maturity curve, longer maturity curve as it relates to engaging in some of these issues. GM is a little bit newer to the game, if you will. But even in that context, we did have the discipline to prospectively define what it is we were going to engage, where it is that we were going to engage, both through our words, our deeds, and then in our culture. And we spent a lot of time as a senior leadership team really talking about what that meant, why it mattered, how we were going to scope that. And, we ultimately hooked back into one of the core values at GM, which is seek truth. That's one of the 4 fundamental values if you go look up information about GM. And that was liberating, and it unlocked some stuff for us. But we decided that we were going to be on the advocacy side, not the activist side yet. Start with advocacy around social justice, education, healthcare, things that are really the fundamental building blocks of systemic racism as we understand it. And we're going to focus on advocacy for those building blocks for Blacks and other marginalized people and individuals. And we say that expressly. That's on our webpage. If you go on gm.com/company and look at this inclusion advisory board, we talk about our words, we talk about our deeds, and we talk about our culture. But it's that level of precision that I think allows us to say, is this one that we're going to step in on or not? How does it link back to what we've already prospectively defined? How does it hook into the value system that we purport as a company? And by the way, that the license that you get comes from your value system and your stakeholders. And oftentimes employees are the most passionate of the stakeholders in terms of when, where, and how a company should step up. So unless you have the discipline to do that kind of now before the next thing comes along, you're always going to be playing catch up, and you're likely to have inconsistent messaging because you're going to react to a moment versus a movement. And I think that's the distinguishing characteristic for me. And, we have this aspiration of wanting to be the most inclusive company in the world. But, when Mary Barra talks about that, she's quick to point out that we want that to be a race to the top. Everybody should want to be the most inclusive company in the world. And we don't have the playbook from September 23rd to some end date on when we will declare ourselves the most inclusive company in the world, but everything we do has to work toward and be in service to that aspiration. And that's how we think about it. But this notion of having the time and the discipline to prospectively define the criteria of how and when and where in a way that links back to your values, that is enabled by your stakeholders, to me, is really the way to line that up.
That's terrific, Craig. And I've often found that sometimes the best questions that I ask are actually probably worded a little bit less well than they should be. So I appreciate the way that worked out pretty well. You know, guys, I'll tell you what, I had a couple more questions for you, but they're just rolling in from the audience. So let's get to it. 15 minutes. I mean, let's devote the rest of the time to our audience because they asked some really good questions. I want to start with this one. It's a little bit on the long side, and I could hear some people on my team at PRWeek saying, gee, Gideon must have written this question because that's about how long he usually writes them. But this is a good one, so I'm going to read it. Our DEI advisor reports to the Chief Human Resources Officer rather than the CEO. As a director of corporate comms, I report into the CCO who sits under the CMO, so we have a lot of bottlenecks. I want to be a catalyst for change, but I am struggling with the glacial pace at which we're moving things forward and how much of our DE&I journey I can or should own. Our leaders are well-intentioned, but to Emily's point, how can someone at a mid-senior level, or actually I'll add even a junior level to it, truly drive forward impactful progress more urgently? So I know there's a long question, but I think the end of it is really talking about how mid and junior level people on an issue that, Emily, the words you used, icky, is always going to stick in my mind because that's really a good way kind of to describe it. How can people at that level really do something to move this issue forward company-wide when there are so many bottlenecks as this audience member described? And I'll give that to any one of you.
I'll jump in.
Can
Go ahead, John.
Sorry, sure.
Just on one aspect of the question, if I may. So when we decided to appoint during the summertime the first ever head of DE&I at FleishmanHillard, Emily, we thought it was really, really important to have somebody in that role who came from the absolute core of our business, somebody who understands all our colleagues and but also really understands our business and understands our clients. And the reason we went that direction was because we felt this was a really much better way to ensure that the conversation stayed front of mind at every meeting and every encounter that we have. I think the experience of a lot of companies is that if you decide to silo this role or these roles and place them in a HR function, then I personally feel they can be somewhat limiting. In terms of the question about colleagues, people from mid ranks or more junior ranks, we've had, even as recently as about 2 hours ago, we had a company-wide what we call Lose the Whisper session, and we've had many of these in recent months where people are able to come on and talk very frankly about their experiences. And I have to say that the contributions of junior, mid-level staff in terms of chiming in have had a huge impression, not just on me, but of all our management at the firm. So I would not underestimate the importance that everybody, whether you're junior or at a mid-level within the firm, but of course it's really important that the firm gives you the outlet in the first place to be able to share your voice.
Mm-hmm. Emily?
Everything John said. And I will just say for a second, and I know this isn't about us and our relationship, but I will say that I have found in him a critical advocate, ally, and insatiable appetite for change against action. And every organization needs a CEO who believes that, not just a human resources head, not just a chief diversity inclusion officer, but a CEO who believes that. And frankly, if we're going to make real progress, your CFO and your COO and the entire C-suite has to, but that comes from the top. And I would encourage the CEOs or those who are in proximity to your CEO to really try to reach a point of declaration here, because I think that is what can stop some of the bottlenecks that this person asked about, because it's an organizational structural issue, right? And change the structure of the organization and the bottlenecks might resolve themselves. One watch out though, Gideon, is that we find a number of our diverse employees, those from all backgrounds, where we're talking about religion, ethnicity, sexual orientation, intersectionality, however they identify, they are over rotating on advancing diversity, equity, inclusions at their organizations and feel like their efforts are not being met with value. They're not a part of performance conversations every year. They're certainly not tied to compensation. They're not evaluated when you're looking at the potential and contributions of these employees. And we should make it every person's responsibility. So similar to how we talked about the job description, I firmly believe that in every annual evaluation, every employee needs a question on how they're impacting and personally contributing to diversity, equity, inclusion at the organization. And I mean everyone. I think the clarity in the bottleneck comes from the top in the organizational structure. And I couldn't agree with John more about who and how the DE&I lead should report. But I also think that those who are passionate, those mid and junior level, might be turned off if they're being messaged by the organization that their contributions won't matter. And I think that we need to change that notion in not only communications, but in our industry at large, so that everyone feels like they're making a contribution that is ultimately important to the culture and to the advancement of the organization, not just your reputation, not just the shareholder price, but actually a place that you want to work and you're proud to be a part of.
Hey, Gideon, can I get in here for a second?
Absolutely.
Sorry.
Of course.
I just want to go back to kind of the root of the question, because I think what this person is asking for is like some sort of practical way to maybe navigate their own organization. So I think yes to everything that John and Emily said. Of course, I doubled down on all of that. But you know, what this person is outlining is not atypical. And I think it's really, we have to be careful to not place the burden on this too junior in the organization. Because I think to Emily's point, that's frustrating, and there's all sorts of reasons why those individuals can't be solely responsible for bringing forth solutions. So in that example where it's sort of like there's such surround sound of the CEO and the reporting structure seems like it's too attenuated and hard to navigate. One thing that I would suggest considering, and I don't know where this individual is from or what the organization is, but one of the things I would consider is recognizing that a lot of times progress is nonlinear. And so it's not necessarily figuring out a way to go up the line to get to the CEO, but perhaps there's ways to come in sideways and other ways to influence the CEO. And there's a really good leadership book out there called You're in Charge, Now What? And it's one of the principles in it is when you're assessing an organization, what it basically says is never underestimate the true seat of power. And the premise is power doesn't always mirror hierarchy, and that there are influencers and influences that don't actually line up from a hierarchical perspective. And so I would encourage you with that as context to try to get a sense of whether or not there's another influence into the CEO, either directly or maybe a two-step approach, somebody who influences somebody, the CEO, and see if you can create a relationship with that person and see if you can create an advocacy in that person so that you're not, going to go knock on the CEO's door and say, I have something to say. Because it's just not practical. So I want to try and give that little nugget to those who find themselves in bottlenecks or somewhere in an organization that it seems impossible to get to the decision maker or influence the decision maker. There's more than one way in.
Thank you so much for that. Again, so many great questions from the audience, but I think I want to focus on the time that we have left on a couple of pretty practical ones, if I may, tactical, practical ones. Okay. How do you, I'm sorry, Emily, I think this was addressed to you, though I certainly welcome Craig and John to comment if they want to. How do you convey the relevancy of DE&I to stakeholders?
Yeah, this is a hard one. And it's hard because the
Sorry.
person who's usually on, can you hear me?
Yeah, it's good to hear you. Sorry.
Okay.
Yes.
So the one that's usually on the receiving end of this question, that's a kind of a personal affront because it's something that people wonder, like, how could you question diversity, equity, inclusion? But to our conversations with clients, their personal beliefs aside, they are trying to make efforts to advance, and they're finding that the stakeholdering requires justification or understanding. And so what we did as an organization is we looked at the risk to the business. Craig said it before, if you don't make a decision, you're going to either find yourself obsolete or alienating the very stakeholders that you're hoping to engage. I do believe that. I think if you are in a business to business environment, whether you're in a B2C environment, there are people and considerations that you must now take into regard if you're talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion and authenticity and your reputation. And we can do all the things in the world to show up as a brand that people want to do business with or want to purchase products from. But if we have fallen short on really advancing the way we look, the way we talk about equity and inclusion, the commitments that we made, that we promised, then I think it's all for naught. And so what I would encourage you to do is go back to the business and look at the imperatives across your business. For us, it was our clients, it was our prospects, but first of all, it was our employees, because if we lose ground with them and they lose trust and faith in us, they won't want to work there. Then it's new recruits, right? Because they won't want to be there. Our clients are expecting us, like Craig said, to show up and be accountable and reflect the mission that they've set for their organization. And for new business, people are looking for the representation of the world. And if we are still showing up, not looking like that world, then what are we doing? And have we the credibility to counsel them? So we looked at our business risk. We looked at the things that made most sense, and we tried to ground our journey there. And I would encourage you to do the same, because you're not going to only get far by saying, of course we should. It makes sense. Why wouldn't we? That, and giving some real tangible examples and data to prove that this is critically important, it'll help you get further.
Terrific. So actually now, and perhaps this will be the last question we have time for, but I think this is also a very good one, very direct. How do you actively address implicit bias and stereotypes, especially when it comes to hiring and promoting? I almost want to focus on the promoting part, because I think earlier in this conversation, we sort of established that maybe they're all major issues, but keeping people in the fold, in the industry, so they can climb up to the VP, SVP, so on and so level, that's really an issue in PR. It's also obviously an issue elsewhere too. How do you address implicit bias and stereotypes when you're making these decisions? I turn it over to any one of you to answer that, because you're all in the positions to counsel on this, I believe.
Can I start this one? I know we don't have too much time left, but this one is particularly near and dear to my heart, because as my team has heard me say more than once, my entire fellowship at the Aspen Institute was on the relationship between individual bias and institutional bias. And I think we spend a lot of time focusing and having conversations around addressing our own individual implicit bias, unconscious bias, which is only part of the equation. The other part of the equation is understanding the institutional bias that exists. And what's been proven is the biases that each one of us hold, and everyone has them, are malleable and oftentimes will conform to the broader institutional biases that are presented based on the circumstances that they find themselves in. And so I think the very, very first step here is to recognize that there is a relationship between individual biases and institutional biases, and you have to attack from both vectors. So I think, many of us have addressed the individual piece, but the institutional piece, I think, is where you get to some of the challenges that we're talking about here. So, for instance, when you look at the criteria that are laid out that prospectively identify what leadership looks like in an organization, oftentimes is inherently biased. And so you have to interrogate that and understand what drove the choices to define what a leader looks like. and how a leader behaves, and recognize that there's almost certainly biases in there. In terms of promotion and progression, there's also likely implicit and inherent biases in those instruments and those tools. And so in some respects, you have to kind of take things apart and put them back together again, but recognizing that if we only talk about bias at the individual level, we're never going to solve for the challenges that we have here, which are actually informed by the institutional level. And the tools and the techniques and all of the assessments that we have in place almost certainly have some degree of bias interjected into them. And it's focusing on that I think is going to unlock some of the things that we're talking about here today.
Thank you for that, Craig. And Emily, John, I'd be very happy to have you chime in on this as well.
No, I concur with everything that Craig has expressed as eloquently as he has. I don't think that all of us are racist, but I do think that most of us are biased. And it's a really good question, and it's something that we have to recognize and confront every day, and to call it out in a much more thoughtful way than heretofore. And every time there's an opportunity and to hire somebody, we've got to really, really think through what is our approach to it. But I see it everywhere. I see it in lighthearted ways. I see it in really terrible ways. I'm an Irish person. I've seen lots of bias over the years in one way or another against Irish people. So I like to think personally I'm alert to this kind of thing, but I also can be responsible for being biased myself. And I'm very lucky that I've got fantastic people around me in our own talent development and HR group who will tap me on the shoulder when they see it. But I think we just all have to be much more mindful of that it's there all the time. And if we recognize it, and every time we're bringing new people on board, that we do it, as I say, in a much more thoughtful way than before, we will start to make the kind of progress we've been advocating for the last hour.
Emily, I'm happy to give you the last word.
Thank you. I have one small thing to say, and this might come, grating to some leaders, and certainly the organization will make a difference. But if you have a diverse, talented professional and they're on the quote unquote bubble, promote them. Don't think about it too much. Think about what the potential is for your organization to achieve substantive change. If there is 20% to go and you can really teach and grow and stretch them, and they have the potential, promote them and pay them, please, what they are deserving of. Please do not promote people without paying them and giving them that equity that is so critical, especially for candidates of color. I think, Gideon, that we have created constructs in corporate spaces that are more limiting than anything. Why do we have to still have a ladder? Why can't we have a lattice? Why can't we have a more complex and dimensioned way of advancement in organizations? And I think that we have to reorganize and rethink that. I think that we have to know talent is the premium. It's always been a war for talent, but for diverse talent right now, they're being recruited every single day. And I would say that the most important thing is to know that they have a path for advancement in your organization. It's not about the money. It's about the potential and the opportunity for advancement along with equitable compensation. Mm-hmm. And I think that for people of color, because we're already lower in the pay scale, right, in the compensation stream, that's statistics, that matters to us that we have a pathway. So I would say, in addition to the bias checking, are you taking time to career path with your diverse employees, ensuring they have a space and a path for advancement in the organization if they know it? That to me is going to make a big difference and probably allow us to see some changes, especially with the Generation Z and younger millennials who are antsy, right? And they can't see themselves being a part of an organization that they're not vested in and they really see change and purpose in. So I hope that helps. And I know we're at time, but I was So happy to get that question because I think it's a really important one.
Given the caliber of speakers, Emily, John, and Craig, and the topic, I knew we'd go over, and I was happy to do it. But our time is past up. So, on behalf of PRWeek, as well as our audience, I sincerely thank Fleishman-Hillard for sponsoring today's event, and of course, much gratitude to John, Emily, and Craig for joining us today. They are credits to their organizations and the industry, and you're helping to move the needle on such an important topic here, and I commend you all for that. I also want to thank all of you, our audience today. I truly appreciate your participation today. I hope you got as much out of it as you were hoping, if not more. Today's webcast will remain available on demand for a year, and I want to make a really, really strenuous point about that, because people who didn't listen to today's event, by all means, tell them about it, because they should. And I'll tell you something else. Even if you did attend today, it wouldn't be a bad idea to look back and listen to it again, because I know there was a lot of really good tactical counsel that was offered today by all three of our speakers that you really, really should listen to. You'll be inspired and educated by it all, and that was the whole point of this today. Of course, I welcome you to check back on PRWeek.com for future webcasts. On behalf of PRWeek, thank you for attending this webcast, Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion from Talk to Transformation. Until next time, this is Gideon Fiddleside, wishing you all the best. To you and your family, stay safe and healthy. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.